Welcome everyone to today's Space Syntax Lab seminar. I'd like to welcome Besnik Murati. He's an entrepreneur and a PhD researcher at the Bartlett School of Architecture. His research interests concerns the metaphysics behind the phenomenon of life, the origin and genesis of living structures, with a focus on space as an immaterial organizer of matter and syntax as the universal working principle of primus motor. In this, he engages with space syntax theory, Kant's and Deleuze philosophy, and biosemiotics. His thesis explores the shared syntax in the genesis of living structure, and Besnik completed the integrated bachelor and master program at the Pristina University in Kosovo in 2007, before completing the Space Syntax Architecture and Cities Masters of Research at the Bartlett in 2018. He's also the founder of the Horizons Group, an urban architectural design consultancy firm, and he's a shareholder and investment analyst in the Prime Group Construction, a retail estate and construction company in Kosovo. And today he will talk about exploring the philosophical background of space syntax, a trialogue of Hillier, Kant, and Deleuze. And before we start, if you have any questions during the talk, please put them in the chat so we can address them at the Q&A at the very end. And with this, I'd like to welcome Besnik and hand over to you.
Thank you, Kimon, for a great presentation. And I hope you will enjoy the presentation. Yeah. In advance, I would apologize for dry and complex material that I'm going to present, but because it centers on the very essence of space syntax, I hope it is followable. However, if something escapes your attention because I haven't devoted the appropriate time due to that something, we will have some minutes after. The title, Exploring the Philosophical Background of Space Syntax, Trialogue of Hillier and Kant and Deleuze, begins with the background, which is or will not give us right. That's why the ground is important. Bill Hillier, the pioneer of space syntax theory and research program, engages with many thinkers during the formative period of theory and later. But one is particularly interesting. In 2008 paper, Space and Spatiality, he appeals to the transcendental empiricism of Gilles Deleuze, where he writes, "This more pragmatic view of how science works has interesting affinity with the philosophy of Gilles Deleuze, perhaps the key philosopher of the orientation toward the material world that underlies much late 20th century interest in space. The guiding notion in Deleuze's work is the transcendental empiricism, defined in contradistinction to Immanuel Kant's transcendental idealism, through which the mind imposes its categories on the world. Deleuze's concepts mean that the world, with all its complexities and contradiction, is the most fertile source for thought. It is the world that leads one to move beyond the accepted conceptualization that structures thought and guides one to new concepts and new modes of thought. Deleuze's philosophy is usually thought of as being somehow antithetical to science, but with one more step, it surely is science. In science, the source of new theoretical ideas is rarely simply abstract thought. More often, it is the bringing to light of new phenomena which are inconsistent with existing theoretical models and so demand novel theoretical thought inspired by the intractability of the world to the abstraction imposed on it. If space syntax research program concerned with the description of reality of urban structure grounds on the central tenet that socio-spatial relationship is intrinsic, if the program develops following the guiding dictum that society must be described in terms of intrinsic spatiality and space must be described in terms of intrinsic sociality, if both the central tenet and accordingly the guiding dictum grounds on two indubitable propositions, space is not a background to human activity but intrinsic to it. Space is first and foremost configurational, for there is no other way that space can be intrinsic to society. Why would Hillier, who might be regarded as empirical realist, appeal to Deleuze, a pure metaphysician as he regards himself? And why would he do that at the expense of Kant's project? This presentation is very short and combination of out of 7 body chapters from my PhD thesis in progress titled The Language of Morphic Languages, exploring the shared syntaxes of urban and biological structure through Bill Hillier's concept of morphic language in dialogue with Gilles Deleuze's philosophy of structure. Today, I will try to unpack the points Hillier was seeking to make by referring to Deleuze by means of bringing Hillier and Deleuze in a substantial dialogue through the mediation of Kant. With substantial dialogue, I mean for one which could bring to inter and transdisciplinary implication. The substantial dialogue thus necessarily centers on the ground, that which gives or not gives right to judgment and proposition of the theory. The presentation is divided into 3 parts. The first part unpacks the appeal and delineates the central theme for the dialogue. Since this is the first ever reference to Deleuze but not to Kant, second part centers on Hillier-Kant relation and looks how could Kant mediate the dialogue. The third part outlines the topic where Hillier-Deleuze dialogue might be grounded. It is straightforwardly perceptible that the appeal ascends on epistemological registers, that there is a problem in the foundation of science, how it works and progresses, and that Hillier and Deleuze shares a view which contradicts Kant. A space syntax researcher could interpret the appeal from 2000 Hillier's and Rafford elaboration in almost identical appeal from 2010 paper. While abstract thought in the appeal stands for philosophical ideas or concepts which are not derived from sense experience, be they observed natural phenomena, experiments, or simulation, the term phenomenon stands for different things in philosophy and science. In philosophy, the term is used to express philosophical ideas about appearance and reality. In science, it stands for an event or process which has a regularity under definite circumstances or condition. That is an event where A always produces B, similarly as to the rotation of the world around its axis as a cause, which gives rise to the appearance that sun rises every day as an effect. The term new phenomena, which Hillier borrows from ion hacking, stands for more than scientific use of the word. In contrast to Popper's conjectures, where experiments are seen as secondary servants to theory, in Hacking's view, scientists are not seen as those which explain phenomena as they discover in nature. They do not explain the sense data of phenomenalism, but rather based on significant regularities of the events, they are useful for speculation and theory formation. Scientists create phenomena which then becomes the foundation of the theory. Differently to Hacking, but similarly to Popper's method, Epstein proposes agent-based computational model for a new tool in empirical research, which can be used to generate phenomena from micro to macro scale. From Hillier's and Rafford's discussion, one may infer that appeal hinges on the methodology on creation of new phenomena as a foundation and development of the theory. The created phenomena have non-sense as cause. They create sense to nonsense. They give sense to metaphysics, a sense of physics. They give an account for the formation of the theory, implicitly delineating Kant as phenomenologist who imposes abstract thought categories upon the world, in contrast to Hillier and Deleuze, metaphysical empiricist inspired by the intractability of the world. Accordingly, a space syntax reader rightly may infer that the central tenet of space syntax research program, the guiding dictum and the indubitables, have empirical origin. Abstracted proposition from the regularity of socio-spatial patterns upon rigorous observation, experiments, agent-based modeling, simulation, and so on. Adding to that, the concept of empiricism in Deleuze's project could lead a space syntax research program affiliate to infer that a possible dialogue with Deleuze ascends on methodology and methods that Kant does not deal with the materiality of space. However, such a possible interpretation of the appeal would be very problematic, because the central tenet gives equal ontological status to space and society. What is the ground and what is the grounded, space or society? The guiding dictum, if society must be described in terms of intrinsic spatiality, space might be described in terms of intrinsic sociality, gives equal ontological status to space and individual. What is the ground and what is the grounded? On the other hand, there is no direct evidence that Hillier et alia have come to proposition for indubitables from experience or the regularity of phenomena based on Popper, Hacking's or Epstein's method, much less that Hillier had a vision about them. Accordingly, the empirical origin likely brings the program implausible for the philosopher of science, for whom science is a structure built upon facts. Accordingly, insofar the indubitables of space syntax research program might have been obstructed on empirical grounds from experience, then it would bring the program inductive in character. But the problem is, whatever Popper, Hacking, Epstein, and Hillier argue, a philosopher of science can't avoid the reading of the passage in the light of David Hume. If it is the ground which gives or not gives right to the proposition and judgments, then Hume cuts it under both empiricist and rationalist method. He asked a simple question: quid facti and quid juris? That is, what are the facts, empirical evidence? What is their justification? By what right the empirical evidence can be considered a fact? And gives the argument for a single but a fundamental concept in metaphysics, namely that of causality, the inner force of regularity in the connection of cause and effects, showing that the principle of causality is not rational in character, neither self-evident nor capable of logical demonstration, providing a direct proof that sense experience is an autonomous logical principle. Without principle, science would be impossible. The fact that experience cannot be the source of evidence until the causal postulate has been independently proved, push science, objectivity of science in the cul-de-sac. If sense experience is not the source of evidence, how is then space syntax research program to justify this description? What is the epistemic warrant of space syntax? How secure is the knowledge it delivers? A philosopher of science could notice that the passage is more complex than what space syntax reader could assume, because it entangles all facets of epistemology, of ontology, metaphysics, theoretical perspective, methodology, and methods. He might speculate that Hillier's affinity with Deleuze ascends through the line of contradistinction between rationalist and empiricist account of knowledge. On theoretical perspective, Kant, the rationalist who imposes categories upon the world, negotiating those reality of the phenomenal world, that is, constrains ontology to how can we know the world, methodology, and methods. Hillier and Deleuze empiricists that abstract concept upon the regularity of the phenomena as the world imposes upon us. However, since the notion of space belongs to metaphysics rather than to epistemology, he would rather constrain himself in contributing the discussion on the materiality of space. Since experience cannot be source of the evidence until Hume's principle has been independently proved, this would limit Hillier's contribution to epistemology of urban structure. And accordingly, space syntax theory as a set of methods and tools concerned with descriptions, not description, of realities, not reality of urban structure, as commonly appreciated. But while the phenomena for scientists are significant regularities that are useful for speculation, for a philosopher, the real problem of regularities is the ground. It is Hume. Because for the reason for things being as they are or as they appear to be is always and only metaphysical. This brings the appeal far more complex than a space syntax research could assume or a philosopher of science dare to discuss. In contrast to both, philosophers cannot avoid the one who brought hell in the philosophy. As Bertrand Russell famously quotes, there is a peculiar painful chamber inhabited solely by philosophers who have refuted Hume. These philosophers, though in hell, have not learned wisdom. They continue to be governed by their animal propensity toward induction. But every time that they have made an induction, the next instance falsifies it. Philosophy renders two essential problems concerning knowledge. The first concerns sense perception. It inquires how it is knowledge possible. The second concerns the problem of judgment. It looks to determine the criterion of truth. Accordingly, Kant and Deleuze, particularly the latter, would rather be very careful when unpacking interpretation where Kant and Deleuze are compared and contrasted, much more if the former is belittled. This mainly due to two main reasons. The transcendental idealism is very hard to master, but I find essentially important for anyone who wants to master from the perspective of the philosophy of science the essence of what space syntax research program is really about. And second, because the ambition of Deleuze's project is taking up the Kantian enterprise and push it further, taking up the Kantian initiative and carrying to completion. Accordingly, If the central problem in the appeal is objective knowledge, and objective knowledge grounds on sense experience, then Hillier and Deleuze dialogue likely should ascend on the theme of origin of sense perception, that is cognition. Since the appeal from 2008-10, respectively, papers in Hillier's only ever reference to Deleuze, but not to Kant. And if Deleuze's ambition is to bring Kant's enterprise to completion, I review first Hillier's interpretation of Kant from the references in the formative period of the theory in the light of what Kant's project is, and only then rediscuss the theme and outline the topic upon which a dialogue with Deleuze could be established. I kindly ask you for a greater focus now. The central idea, consistent in all three references, is that in Kant's project, space, time, and causality, some were qualified as empirical concepts or as basic categories. Are not intrinsic properties of nature, but rather abstraction imposed upon the mind, by the human mind, because they are built into the structure out of our perception and understanding in a such way that we can not escape from them. Additionally, Hillier and Lehman qualifies Kant's concept project as mistaken by drawing on the discovery of non-Euclidean geometries. But the problem is that space and time are not elements in Kant's set of categories. In Kant, the category stands for a priori characteristic of the representation of any object in general before it has been experienced. Only Hume causality is a category. What are space and time in Kant's transcendental idealism? I will comment first that if one defines Kant's transcendental idealism from concepts, as Hillier and Lehman do, it would be for Kant the negative definition of what transcendental ideal philosophy is, that it is a principle of synthetic a priori knowledge from concepts. Transcendental idealism is the doctrine of a priori universal and necessary conditions for cognition, where transcendental stands for the doctrine of a priori universal and necessary conditions for sense experience, thus knowledge. Idealism was source of the dispute. In Kant's, idealism is not as commonly employed, which signifies any philosophy which denies the existence of an independent world corresponding to our subjective representation. That is, what we believe to perceive as things are not our only representation in us, to which no object existing outside us corresponds, implying that their reality is assigned by our mind. It is not a kind of idealism which does not deny the existence of outer object of the senses, but only does not admit that their existence is known through immediate perception, and who therefore concludes that we can never, by way of any possible experience, be completely certain of their reality, but it is a doctrine of universal and necessary a priori principles which condition the correspondence or structure between things as they are with their subjective representation. Kant saw that the risk from misinterpretation and clarified this in Opus Posthumum, that transcendental idealism is realism in an absolute sense, and suggests that an empirical realism can be grounded on it. Thus, in Kant, the proposition that our cognition does not conform to the objects, but rather objects must conform to our cognition, in the jargon of that an architect as I am, it would understand better. Our objective understanding does not conform to urban form. The urban form must conform to our objective understanding, is the groundbreaking idea in the knowledge known as Kant's Copernican revolution. Kant's transcendental doctrine consists of two parts: transcendental aesthetic and transcendental logic. The first concerns with the sensible part, the second concerned with intelligible part. Sensibility or receptivity stands for the capacity to acquire representation through the way in which we are affected by objects. Differently, perception stands for empirical representation with consciousness. Of course, object must be given for us to be empirically represented in consciousness. When sense perception is objective, it is called cognition. Sense perception is objective only when it is pure intuition for Kant, not mixed with empirical intuition. But what is pure and empirical intuition in Kant? What's the difference? Allow me to outline first the faculties of cognition and their function in Kant. There are 4 faculties of cognition in Kant, in Kant's transcendental philosophy. Intuition is the faculty of receiving impressions, the core faculty in Kant's philosophy. Understanding, the faculty of producing rules and concepts. Judgment, for determining whether a rule or concept is subsumed under rules or concepts or is standalone. And reason, the highest faculty of cognition, is the faculty that produces principle. Intuition is the primitive faculty of cognition, while understanding, judgment, and reason are higher faculties. Intuition and concepts are the 2 modes of representation of thing in general. Intuition, translated from German, stands for looking at or looking upon. In this context, the word intuition does not have the connotation of following or feeling as we speak in English, or deciding by intuition. Intuition and concept are very important for today's purposes. Cognition is either intuition or concept. In contrast to sensation, which is nothing but a subjective state of the subject itself, Kant regards intuition as objective, immediate, and singular representation of object. Intuition contains only the way in which we are affected by objects. Accordingly, the distinction between sensation and intuition is fundamental in the proper reading of the transcendental idealism and the overarching conception of space and time in the transcendental aesthetics. Aesthetic in Kant is not about something that stands for sensual feeling or the aesthetic appeal of things. In Kant, the aesthetic is about the conditions of experience, Kant's official project. The essential important distinction between sensation and intuition, accordingly, hinges on the notion of representation which does not derive from experience but precedes it, which Kant calls a priori representation. Representation are a priori or pure if they contain nothing that belongs to sensation. On the right side, in contrast, in sensation is mixed or contained in the intuition, it is empirical. Accordingly, intuition can be either pure or empirical. Empirical intuition is related to the object through sensation. They are possible only a posteriori. They contain both the form and the matter or content under which something is intuited. Pure intuition is not related to the object through sensation. They are possible only a priori. They contain only the form under which something is intuited, not the matter, but that in which our sensations are merely arranged, and by which they are susceptible of assuming certain forms, cannot be itself sensation. It is then for the matter or content of all phenomena that is given to us a posteriori. The form must lie ready a priori for them in the mind, and consequently can be regarded separately from all sensation. Pure intuition, which occurs a priori, even without an actual object of the senses or sensation, is a mere form of sensibility in the mind. Kant names this science of all principles of a priori sensibility transcendental aesthetic, which lays out the a priori structure that precedes any experience of objects, namely the science of space-time as to pure form of intuition. Kant gives 2 arguments for the a priority of space and time, and 2 arguments for space and time being intuitions, not concepts. The a priori arguments point out that space and time are universal and necessary conditions for experience. The intuition arguments point out that space and time are non-discursive. They are pure intuition, not concepts. Non-discursive means that we do not have to talk about it because we don't have a proper concept for it. Too much text, but I will have to read it. It's a fundamental for presentation. First, a priority argument of space and time. Space and time are not empirical concepts which have been abstracted from experience. For sensation to be related to things outside me, and for me to be able to represent these sensations as outside and alongside one another, and hence not merely as different, but as in different places, the representation of space must a priori be in us, intrinsic character of space. Similarly, if the representation of time did not exist as a foundation a priori, we could not represent to ourselves that things exist together at one and the same time, or at different times, that is, contemporaneously, or in a succession, the intrinsic character of time. Accordingly, the representation of space and time cannot be borrowed from the relation of outer appearances through experience, coexistence, and succession of things. But this outer experience is itself first possible only by means of that representation, not extrinsic character of space and time. For relation to be intrinsic, it must affect us from inside. For relation to be extrinsic, there must be something inside that is affected from something that is outside. Second, a priority argument of space and time. Space and time are necessary and universal representation of a priori all phenomena. Space is the foundation of all external phenomena, co-presence. Time is the foundation of all internal intuition, self-awareness, and co-presence. We can easily represent to ourselves space without object, or time void of phenomena, but we can never make a representation of the absence of space, nor take away from the phenomena, universal and necessary character of space and time in sense experience. Space and time are those a priori condition for the possibility of phenomena and by no means as determination dependent upon them, a priori and configurational character of space and time. Moreover, by the priority of time is given additional axiomatic importance to space on regard of experience and reality of phenomena. Different times are not coexistent, but continuous. Different spaces are not continuous, but coexistent. Time-space rather than space-time. If we cannot represent to ourselves space and time off, but always on, then space and time are something we think with rather than something we think of. We can think of God existing in this, but not in the next moment, but not of space. First argument for space and time being intuition, not concept. Space and time are not discursive. It has general conception of relation of things, but pure intuitions. We can talk of different parts of space and different fragments of time, but they merely belong to one and the same representation of space and time. We cannot derive proposition that different spaces cannot be continuous or that different times cannot be coexistent from the general conception of space and time. That is, that space here is not the same as space there, or that space of London is contained in the space of England, or regarding time, that yesterday, today, and tomorrow is the same time. There is one space and one time. For these propositions are contained immediately in the intuition and representation of space and time. Representation, which can only be given as single objects, are pure intuitions. Intuition are representation of single things. Concepts are general representation of potentially many things. From this, it follows that space and time are a priori intuition underlying all concepts. Space and time are non-discursive because they are not concepts we can discuss in terms of other concepts. Space and time only secondarily can be concepts. Second argument for space and time being intuition, not concept. Space and time are represented as infinite given quantities. If space and time were concepts generated by a process of adding parts of space or time together, we would never reach an actual infinite space or time. The infinity of space and time is not the same as infinity of many small space and times, not as adding cubic meters at days until infinity. The cubic meter and the day are only conceptual limitation of the same space and time, which is possibly only upon the premise of immediate intuition of space and time. There is only one space and one time. Consequently, the original representation of space and time is intuition a priori, not a conception. Space and time are intuition, not something that is intuited. Apparently, these arguments about the nature of space and time, which Kant presents as a direct proof of transcendental idealism, clearly points to ontological not epistemological nature of the project. Interestingly, Kant's argument on the priority of space and time can be observed in the Newton's unpublished paper until 1962, where he writes, although we can possibly imagine that there is nothing in space, yet we cannot think that space does not exist, just as we cannot think that there is no duration time, even though it would be possible to suppose that nothing whatever endures, although this is neither revealed to us by God nor known through perception. The analogy is intriguing, considering the fact there was a little or no possibility at all that Kant has had access to this paper when he wrote the first critique. Therefore, in Kant's term, intuition need not to be confused only with the following, the feeling or deciding by intuition, but neither with empirical intuition for instance, in the someone which after some years in studying spatial networks of cities using space syntax method and tools could intuitively approximate prior to running any analysis on the computer network properties for any settlement in the world merely by looking at the layout map. Nor with Christopher Alexander employment of the term, intuition is not a procedure in the design. See Hillier's critique on how Alexander spoils the term. Nor it should be confused with the everyday use of the term intuition. It is not something like intuitive grasping. For example, Apple iOS is very intuitive, because without intuition, we would not have neither representation of ourself, self-awareness, nor of external world, the co-presence, and perhaps could try to pass through walls without being aware of their or our existence. In this sense, intuition is not limited to humans, but appertain absolutely to all animate beings of whatsoever kind of sensation they may have, and from whatsoever object affected. From molecules, they do not see, but they are sensitive to light. They do not hear, but they react to sounds. They do not smell or taste, but they detect hormones to everything made of them. We have seen that space and times are pure form of intuition in Kant, not concepts. But what is concept in Kant? All our knowledge consists of two components, intuition and concept, which lie a priori at the foundation of knowledge, and understanding. Kant puts in one of his famous passages that concepts without intuition are empty, but intuitions without concepts are blind. Experience requires both intuition and concepts, whereas intuition is objective, immediate, and singular representation of an object. By difference, concept is mediated relation by a means of a characteristic mark which may be common to several objects. The way in which sensibility presents data to the understanding for its conceptualization already reflects a particular manner of receiving it. That is a certain form of sensible intuition which is determined by the nature of the subject, not by the affecting subject. This does belong to the faculty of understanding. Neither of these faculties, sensibility and understanding, can exchange its proper function. The understanding can intuit, The understanding can intuit nothing. The sensors can think nothing. Thus, there is no other way than from the united operation of both, that is, synthesis, can knowledge arise. If the doctrine of space and time is the first major part of the model of Kant's model of the mind, the doctrine of synthesis is the second. The doctrine of as we know from the transcendental aesthetic, the first thing that we must be given a priori to us for the sake of cognition of all objects is the manifold of pure intuition. The second is the synthesis of this manifold through imagination. It must associate spatial temporal structure items with other spatial temporal structures. In the first and second constitutes intuition. In Kant, imagination is not a play of fantasy as we assume today, but rather an act of bringing the manifold of intuition in the form of image. Imagination has a central function in perception. The third requirement for the cognition is concepts. They give unity of synthesis, which must recognize items using concept, or the categories in particular. The first two syntheses, intuition and imagination, are inseparable. One cannot occur without the other. They do not require the third. The third synthesis requires the other two as a unity, but is not required by them. These acts of synthesis are governed by autonomous principles which can neither generate nor prevent. If understanding requires both intuition and imagination, if intuition is two kinds, pure and empirical, then concepts necessarily are of two kinds, pure and empirical, dissimilar as much as pure and empirical intuitions are. But unlike pure intuition, which contains only the form under which something is intuited, pure concept contains only the form of the thought of an object in general. Pure concepts like pure intuition are predisposition in the human understanding. Empirical concepts are derived from experience. Since the day we have seen the world, pure intuition is intermixed with empirical intuition, and consequently, our understanding of the world is of two kinds. Pure and understanding. Pure understanding is a form of objective knowledge which derives solely from a priori principles of combination of the manifold of pure intuition into unity of representation. Pure understanding proceeds from transcendental, pure logic. In distinction, understanding is a form of subjective knowledge which is derived from mixture of pure and empirical concepts. Understanding proceeds from the general logic. A synthesis is pure if the manifold is given a priori, not empirically, and impure if the manifold is mixed between a priori and a posteriori. This science, which excludes all these those cognitions which were of empirical content and examines only those pure form, is transcendental logic. The pure synthesis considered generally yields the pure concepts of understanding. Kant conceptualizes such concepts as categories, a priori principles of combination of the manifold of pure intuition into a unity of representation. In difference to pure concepts which derive from pure understanding, empirical concepts are derived from the understanding which process through empirical intuition. Kant's doctrine of empirical concepts, as Hillier qualifies, and their formation is a complex topic that has no implication on the present purpose. It is sufficient to say that space and time are neither pure nor empirical concepts. Space and time are pure. Intuition only secondarily can be concepts. Today, we are not going to discuss the other two higher faculties, judgment and reason, although the whole project begins on the question, how is synthetic a priori judgment? Hume's question, Hume's autonomous principle. Kant argues that a priori synthetic judgments are possible, but they require pure intuition and pure concepts for a predicate. In contrast to the faculty of understanding and judgment, which have their canon of objectively valid employment within transcendental logic, the transcendental use of reason is not objectively valid or impossible. To summarize, pure intuition and pure concepts are a priori forms of conditions. Pure intuition is the ultimate condition for cognition. Empirical intuitions and empirical concepts are a posteriori forms of cognition, but not derived merely from experience. Pure intuition does not require experience or whatever knowledge. Pure intuition is ultimately objective. Empirical intuitions derive from diverse experiences, and so they are not ultimately objective. Accordingly, if science is about objective knowledge, it needs pure understanding, and pure understanding requires pure intuition, not empirical intuitions. But since our intuition is always mixed, pure intuition is what remains after removal from a representation of an object, all that the understanding thinks as belonging to an object, and also after removal of whatever belongs to sensation, that is, after removal from the general logic, the applied logic. What remains from the empirical intuition is just extension and form, that is, space and time. Accordingly, intuition, while being the primitive faculty, but on which the true value of all concepts that the faculty of understanding produce, for which Kant says that they lie, the pure concept lie ready until they are finally developed on the occasion of experience and exhibited by the same understanding in their purity, freed from the empirical conditions attaching to them. In this process, which goes in this way, where everything is filtrated through pure intuition, that is, through space and time, follows that intuition, a priori intuitions, determines confirmation or refutation of theories. They give or not give right to concepts used in our propositions. Thus, insofar knowledge does not ground on pure intuition, following Kant, it would mean as hitting the wall with a reason. There is, from what has been elaborated so far, it can be noticed a pervasive inconsistency in Hillier interpretation of Kant. The representation of Kant is in the first paper is correct, except that space, time, and causality do not belong to the same faculty of cognition. They cannot exchange their function. Space and time belong to the faculty of intuition. Causality is the faculty of understanding. Space and time are pure forms of intuition, and themselves intuition, not empirical concepts. Empirical concepts are derived from experience, synthetic in character. Space and time are a priori, universal, and necessary conditions for cognition. Empirical concepts are not. Space and time are not discursive because they are not concepts that we can discuss in terms of other concepts. Space and time only secondarily can be concepts. Inconsistency 3. Just a second. Causality is not empirical concept, but pure. Pure concepts, categories derived from pure understanding. Pure concepts are analytic. Empirical concepts are derived from the understanding process through empirical intuition. Empirical concepts are synthetic. The idea that empirical concept like space and time has been quickly shown to be mistaken by, for example, the discovery of non-Euclidean geometries is incorrect. From 1747, Kant recognizes that we can certainly think of different kinds of spaces having different properties, including different dimensions, and we can do it so conceptually, symbolically, and analogically through mathematics, and adds that the science of all these possible kinds of spaces would undoubtedly be the highest enterprise, which is a finite understanding could undertake in the field of geometry, but we cannot represent non-Euclidean space to ourselves. Accordingly, even space would have been concept in Kant, what we have seen that it is not. Hillier interpretation is inconsistent on the regard of multidimensionality of space because Kant knew such possibility. If intrinsic character of space and time appertains to all animate being, from molecules and everything that nature is made of, the intrinsic character of space and time necessarily appertains to nature itself. The idea that subject imposes categories upon the world is inconsistent too. The subject in Kant is not the ground, it is the grounded. So what if Hillier's interpretation of Kant is incorrect? It might become an issue in space syntax community, because if space and time are a priori universal and necessary condition for self-awareness and co-presence, if that is all what space does, it creates co-presence, it does not create interaction, says Hillier in Sarah Vesnin's interview. If space and time are intrinsic and necessarily real, just as real as I am myself, it follows that space and time are a priori universal and necessary conditions for the very existence of society. If that holds true, I don't see on what grounds one can speak of the material reality of space and time in social processes outside Kant's framework of space and time, suggesting the Kantian background of the theory of the research program. The true extent of Kantian influence to space syntax appear underestimated, while the study brings him the central philosophical figure in development of space syntax research program. If the ground is that which will or will not give right to proposition, then it follows that Kant is the epistemic warrant of the program. As you can see in the following scheme, the proposed legal structure of the ground of space syntax research program. For why Kant project was underestimated and misinterpreted, I do not know, nor is the concern of neither this presentation nor of my PhD study. It is interesting to note that there are no references of Kant in the formative period from primary sources. There are no references of Kant neither in the social logic of space nor in the space is the machine. So what if Kant is the central philosophical figure? Kantian foundation contributes on sharp philosophical distinction of space syntax theory and research program from other theories and programs, as well as in the delineation of those which can engage in substantial dialogues. The study suggests that Kant is a mediator of all substantial dialogues, likely only trialogues there can be. What now about dialogue with Deleuze? If it is not the question whether the world is pre-structured, the indubitable central tenet, but how it is pre-structured, the guiding dictum, this would bring the representation, this would bring the representation of this would bring the representation of Hillier as structuralist, and accordingly limit his contribution in the epistemology of urban structure, space syntax theory to space syntax research method as a methodology, set of method and tools. But if the vocation of science is to explain, not to describe, the constituted, the grounded, does not resemble its process of production in constitution. In the same way, the car does not resemble the production line which built it. The indubitable propositions are never explained. If space and time inhere in subjects prior to any representation and appertains to anything that is aware of itself and objects other than itself, then the real questions become how space attained intrinsic and configurational character in human activity and behavior, the grounding. If space is intrinsic and configurational to human activity, which in turn depends upon sense perception, the question how space attained intrinsic and configurational character become how is sense perception synthesis constructed, the genesis of cognition. If sense perception is inseparable from the problem of the origin and evolution of life, then the question becomes how is life constructed, the genesis of life. Interestingly, there is one thing that Hillier appreciates about Kant. He regards Kantian synthesis as of the highest importance in the history of philosophy and meta-scientific thought, and the proposition that philosophy of science is to state frankly that the object of science is cognition, set at the outset of the formative period of theory, signals a possibility for a narrow passage for Hillier Deleuze dialogues outside Kant's ground. This narrow passage is the materiality of space in the genesis of cognition. This leads to the Hume hell out of the problem of causality, but particularly to Deleuze, who claims that empiricism is a philosophy of the imagination and not a philosophy of the senses. The logical question that follows is, what kind of empiricist is Bill Hillier? What is space syntax theory about? We know that space syntax research program concerns urban structure, but what is space syntax theory about? Cognition or urban structure, or both, or many, or more? However, the very idea that Deleuze, to bring Kant's project to completion, indicates that something is missing rather than a contradiction with Kant. In conclusion of my presentation today, I will say only that for Kant, matter does not organize itself, but is organized by what is a material, and there can be living bodies, not matter. The vital principle is a material. Thank you for your attention and patience.